Hello there, so let's talk about pencils. While in school, I'd always be aiming to reduce my pencil down to a stub through sheer extensive use. Breaking the pencil and sharpening an end wouldn't really cut it. There was some satisfaction that came from knowing I physically worked my pencil down to the bone. I'm sure every one of you knows the feeling. It's the same as crossing each item off a to-do list. This type of gratification could apply to anything, so it naturally made up how I play a lot of video games, and of course, Osu is no exception. To explain how, though, you may need some context. Modding discussions, also known as Modding V2, have fully replaced the old forum modding system as of a couple months ago. Every new uploaded map has its own fancy discussion panel, while the forum is practically inaccessible with no option for posting. Only a small percentage of maps remain on the forum, and that number can only shrink as time goes on. Which brings us to this page, the pending map list of the old website. This shows unranked maps sorted firstly by nomination status, as in maps with their first of 2 nominations are at the top, while everything else with no nominations is below it, and it's sorted secondly by star priority. That's the number here, loosely indicating how much people support the map. It goes down steadily until the nomination status break, where it resets and goes down again. Clearing the bubbles from this list has been a goal for nominators multiple times in the past. There's been some threads of BNs organizing who would handle which maps, all of which started out with promise, but quickly faded as people came to terms with how impractical of a task it was. Not every nominator followed through with the maps they reserved, and there was always a stream of new bubbles replacing those being processed. Ever since I've paid attention to the catalog of maps here, which has been like 3 or 4 years, bubbles have extended past the first page here onto the second. I have heard stories of a time before that though, when mapping wasn't as competitive and nominators had to actually clear this list entirely. For the relatable reason I mentioned at the start of this whole thing, an empty bubble list has always been appealing to me. I've gone on modding sprees multiple times sorting through maps on this list, though having any substantial effect on it has never been realistic. Until now, potentially. With the modding discussions takeover currently underway, there are fewer forum-based maps being nominated, and eventually, this list will run down to 0. Not anytime soon, but eventually. So now is the perfect time to try doing what many nominators, myself included, have tried time and time again, to clear as many bubbles from this list as possible. Or maybe I should set a more realistic goal. I can't process maps for the other 3 game modes, so it's literally impossible for me to clear the whole list. I'll instead try something practical. I'll try getting the pending map list down to 1 page of bubbles total. Yeah, that's what I told myself a month ago, on December 22nd. That was the first day I started taking action. There are 50 maps per forum page, so looking at the second page of maps for that day, there were 41 maps total. That meant 41 maps to process, give or take a few depending on what other nominators did. Based on my first day's progress, I thought this whole thing would be over pretty quick. I modded 18 maps over the course of a few hours, then posted all mods at once to see what kind of a dent it would make. 4 maps were taken out of the pool immediately because there were bubble pops for mostly small and rankable issues, while the rest, with my name on the right side here, were going to be qualified as soon as the respective mappers responded. I'm often asked what I focus on when modding, and this back-to-back session of checking decent rankable maps made that more than apparent. What you're looking at here is a day's mods color-coded by topic, and up here is the summation of those numbers. 2/3 of what I pointed out in my 18 mods were mistakes on the mapper's end. At least, that's what it looked like. Hit sounding made up the bulk of mistakes. This is when, for example, a mapper misses a clap sync to a snare drum sound in a song, where elsewhere in the map, they have that same snare drum hit sounded. Comboing mistakes were a bit less common. They're mostly caused by mappers straying from their ordinary one-measure comboing pattern without indication from a song, or there's slight inconsistencies between repeated parts of a map. I pointed out a few spacing problems across multiple maps too. That doesn't mean what people might think it does though. I didn't say like, your spacing here was a little bigger so this one should be the exact same size. Getting that precise is usually not worth it. Instead, I pointed out what looked like unintended breaks in spacing consistency. Mostly visual mistakes, that's all. Slider velocity in conjunction with the spacing stuff also showed up in like 5 of the maps I modded. To form streams, mappers enable distance sat for equal spacing between circles, but they sometimes forget about how slider velocity multipliers ruin that consistency. A stream following distance sap at 1 times with a 1.2 times multiplier on the final slider would look something like this, which a lot of mappers don't notice for some reason. Perhaps it's my skin that makes it obvious because of these small gaps, but either way, this mistake happens way too often. It doesn't happen as much as my biggest trigger though, mistakes caused by stacking. If you haven't already, just enable stacks in the editor. Go view, yeah, okay, that's it. Maybe it doesn't look bad in the editor with stacks disabled, but 99% of people are going to be playing the map, and that's kind of where it matters. All this is really basic, but yeah, those are the most common mistakes I addressed in those 18 mods. The remaining 1/3 of my mod content was suggestion of changes that I think better supported each song. Like, for example, almost all of my rhythm-related points were suggestions. This normal difficulty used a slider during a pause in the song, which I suggested against. The result was this. The same sort of suggestions went towards what I considered incorrect interpretations of a song too. This map, for example, organized 1/3 rhythms in groupings of 2, while I thought groupings of 3 were way more supported, so the mapper changed it to this. Readability suggestions went the same route. Unexpected rhythm in the song here, I suggested more predictable placements, and the mapper changed it. I could go through everything here, but I think you get what I mean. So, these modding stats may be interesting, however, I don't think they'll be applicable to everyone. You see, modding as a nominator ends up being much different from modding as a normal user. Almost every map I checked during this session was of a decent level of quality, considering another nominator approved of it, and acting as a nominator myself here, I was just helping to iron out a few last-minute errors in whatever regions mattered, leading to a fairly even spread across most mapping categories. That's probably why most of what I covered here was minor mistakes and each mod was so short. If I modded a map with real problems, that might have changed. And luckily for comparison, I did just that. Only one of the 17 maps I modded had what I'd consider major problems, which was potentially why it was bubbled for over a year. My mod consisted entirely of suggestions to relate the map more closely to the music through major adjustments to slider velocity, spacing, and rhythm choice throughout long sections. If all 18 were maps like this, there would be a major change in these stats. Overall though, the answer to the question, what do you focus on when modding, is nothing specific. I cover all aspects of mapping by simply pointing out anything that seems wrong in the context of a map and song. I don't only mod with like rhythm or spacing or aesthetics in mind. Hit sounds may be the most common problem because they're easy to forget, but everything else applies with no specific priority. Oh, and also stacks. Please, stop. Anyway, that leads us into the second day of modding, the day that made me realize clearing the second page of bubbles was gonna be hard. On the first day, I targeted maps I mostly knew I would have an easy time modding, whereas those were almost all gone by the second. I modded 5 maps, but then stopped myself from doing more because I didn't feel comfortable processing some of the other bubbles. Do you ever wonder why some maps are bubbled for so long? You can see the dates here marking that time. There's a lot of maps that have been bubbled for over a month. Surely someone has looked at them before. What's going through a nominator's head when they look at a map and neither qualify it nor pop the bubble? First off, they're probably just not interested. Beat map nominators deal with a bunch of maps every day, so they dedicate their time to the ones they want to check the most and ignore everything else. That shouldn't be a revelation to anyone. Setting that situation aside, however, there may be other reasons why some nominators avoid action on certain maps. I don't know about anyone else, but for me, it's usually a case of imagining the worst possible scenario. Like, let's look at this map for example. I hesitated modding this map for the silliest reason. I didn't think the mapper would fix some simple patterns. One was a 1/6 rhythm beginning on an unexpected purple tick, whereas doing so on the red tick where the rhythm starts would be way more intuitive. There was also something similar to that later on, a triple starting from a spinner's end that was basically a hard to interpret double. If you tried playing this according to the music, you'd probably click early. Because I assumed the mapper wouldn't change these, I thought about just not posting a mod. I wasn't planning on ranking the map if these were left unchanged after all because something personal quality standards, and worst case, I'd be in a bad relationship with the mapper afterwards. Still, I did it in the end and it turned out fine, but for other maps, that won't always be the case. This is another bubbled map. Overmapped rhythms make up the entire design, and while it's cool looking and it sounds nice because of hit sounding techniques used and I think I'm in love, I wouldn't consider it suitable for rank. In a mod post though, what would I say? Nerf your entire map? Delete this? Anything to reduce the overmapping would go against the mapper's intent and would definitely be rejected. All I'd be doing in that situation is making the map creator mad, especially since he's shown that he's not going to change it after seeing other mod responses. This thought process is bad from a quality control standpoint for sure, but putting myself at the center of drama is not what I want to do as a nominator. I find it a lot more productive to focus on maps I feel are worth promotion and avoid maps that are potential bombs waiting to explode, so that's what I did for the following days of this bubble clearing spree. Over the next week or two, I modded a couple maps per day, gradually working through the list and lowering the amount of bubbles. That pace was the most I felt I could do really, since for one reason or another, I avoided posting mods on most maps. It wasn't all bad though. I got to pop the bubble of a restricted users map that was clogging up the list for months, and that satisfied me really more than it should have. A step above that, however, was the near completion of the goal I'd set. Daily progress wasn't as fast as it was at the start, but with work from other nominators around the same time and a final push of handling about 6 maps in a day, this list gradually shrunk to nothing by the 11th of January. For the most part, this is what all those bubble reservation threads and my past modding sprees aim to achieve. The knowledge that over 3 weeks, the bubbles on the second pending maps page were all crossed off the list was more than satisfying. What made this even better though was that the goal I set at the start of this whole ordeal was pretty much complete, which I didn't actually think was going to happen when I started it. I finally ruined my pencil. Look at it, it's a stub, so now I need a new one. A new one which just so happened to be in development while I was doing all this bubble processing. On the new website, there's now a list of pending maps that has the same functionality as the old pending maps forum. It orders maps by nominations, anything with one being at the top, everything else being below, and all maps are sorted by hype count as a replacement for star priority. Of course, that also means every map here is handled under modding v2. Or modding discussion, it's the thing you're looking at. This list is likely where I'll be searching for maps to mod in the future. It'll grow infinitely with more and more maps using the new modding system, so I'll have any number of maps to choose from when looking for something I like. Maybe it won't be as satisfying as clearing a whole page of bubbles, but it still feels nice to cross a single thing off this list anyway. And most importantly, I can finally hide all the game modes I don't care about. This is the ideal bubble list. So yeah, that was the super abridged version of my journey taking on bubbles and various thoughts that came along with it. Please enable stacks in the editor. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.